Lurae Stuart. I welcome you to the Snack and Learn webinar, Supporting Resiliency Through Managing Safety and Security Risk. I want you to know that there will be time for questions at the end of the presentation. You are free to write them in the question box of the GoToWebinar control panel during the presentation. Also, if you want the presentation, it's available in the handout section under the control box. So with that, we will begin the presentation. So again, I'm Lurae Stuart. I'm the manager of the Transit and Rail Safety and Security team at WSP. I'm based in Portland, Oregon in the US. I want to tell you a little bit about our practice. We do safety and security emergency management. And though mostly it is aimed at transit and rail, we often look at adjacent and associated infrastructure and programs. We manage our program through looking at all hazards. We try to balance safety and security in our assessments. We do a lot of safety and security plans and processes, and strategic consulting for integrating safety and security in various types of programs. We prioritize a cross-disciplinary approach, working with physical security professionals who do protective design, security and communications engineering, and work very closely in the planning, design, engineering, and construction of projects and programs. The agenda today, we'll be talking about how risk and resiliency work together, risk assessments, how to look at capacity and capacity targets, the development of resiliency, and then we'll do some closing activities before questions. So what is resilience? Well, resilience is the ability of a substance or objects to spring back into shape. It's how elastic that object is. The major inputs in resiliency have to do with in advance of an event, planning, prepping, and hardening. When an event occurs, it's how effectively you respond. And at all times, it's continually improving. Planning is the offensive move in a mitigation of safety and security risk. Responding is the defensive activity. Of course, this is only one definition of resilience. There are other discipline-specific definitions of resilience, but I like this one because it speaks to how you expand and contract when an event happens. So what does this mean with safety and security? By evaluating safety and security risk, we can identify gaps, and by identifying gaps and manage them, we build resilience. The greatest risk of any program or event is the integration of system elements together or integration of a system into an environment. By evaluating safety and security and emergency management, we can address and identify those hazards and vulnerabilities and prepare for those events in advance. It's important because that's how you build resiliency. What is safety and security assessment? Well, it's simply applying a methodology to identify and evaluate safety hazards and security vulnerabilities. We look at the likelihood and probability of an event. We determine how bad or severe that event might be, and that helps us determine the risk. It's really important to understand that this process needs to be data-driven. And it's important to understand that this risk is owned by the agency or the entity. It can't be given away. It can't be insured against, because once people are injured or equipment or facilities are damaged, that has already happened. So we need to prepare ahead of time. It's also important to understand that you need to compare the risk in your methodology with the agency or the entity's risk tolerance. Everybody's risk tolerance is different. I'm a fairly risk tolerant person. I've traveled a lot. I have a big family. Others are risk adverse. Agencies and entities are similar. They have different risk tolerances based on their culture, based on their community, based on the services they provide. So risk needs to be evaluated and compared to that agency or entity's risk tolerance, not a generic, not a global consideration of risk tolerance. As I've said, there's many ways and many risk evaluation methodologies. Different people, different programs use different methodologies. Here are a few. These are mostly specific to either transit, or the FEMA one is based on environmental risk. It's important to know that they can be qualitative or quantitative, but they're usually based on experience and data. And those are key elements in having an effective risk management process. If you have the right people in the room, if you have the right data and information, then you can make a good assessment of what kind of risk is being posed by different scenarios. Another element is to understand capacity and capacity targets. To determine the risk being faced, you have to understand, what do I already have in place? What equipment, what technology, what plans or processes? All of those pieces give us a basis to understand our level of risk. Then I need to evaluate, what do I need? What gaps do I have? What resources do I need to identify? Do I have the right coordination and communication? Do I have the right skill set? And then I have to understand, where do I want to be? So how long can I be out of business? What are my expectations to keep operating at some level during an event or during some kind of incident? What's a tolerable level of loss? That's a hard question when you're talking about loss of staff, loss of capacity, loss of money. But I have to understand, what is that bottom line? Who's depending on me? It's another piece. When I determine my target, I have to understand who else is waiting for me to perform my business and is dependent on that. And then, can I afford the targets? I have been in a program or in an environment where we're talking about this end goal, and somebody said, well, I want a transit system, but I don't want anybody to ever get hurt or injured. And the answer is, well, then you better not open that transit system, because people will get hurt or injured in context with that system. So understanding all of these pieces help you understand what capacity you're starting with, what gaps exist, and what you want to get as an end goal. So we do that after we evaluate safety and security and emergency management, and we develop mitigations. This identification of mitigations make events either less likely to happen, less severe in their context, or provide for a better response. It is important that we understand what our goals are, and we involve key stakeholders. We have to have the right people at the table. We have to communicate what we're trying to achieve and how we're going about getting there. And we have to protect those mitigations or those controls that we're building into the program from value engineering or from resource, from evaluating resources. So all of this process of providing ownership of the mitigations is important. Sometimes we think about those satellite from the sky events that are even hard to imagine. I think sometimes they're called the black swan events. COVID is such an event where no one could consider the impact of COVID on all of the programs and systems that we have. But every program that has prepared for other types of pandemics or prepared for other events, we're a little better off than those that didn't. Developing resilience by assessing, by planning, by preparing is a lot less cumbersome and expensive than retrofitting and reacting. Ignoring the mitigation will cost you more in the long run. So then, how do you identify the proper mitigations? What happens? What's that process beside this risk evaluation process? Well, I sit sometimes in these planning sessions and I hear us have discussions around what are the regulations. So we'll design to the regulations. That's great. Regulations and laws are a good start, but they are developed for generic situations and are usually considered minimum standards. Specific projects, specific programs bring additional hazards or vulnerabilities into play that may not be addressed by regulation. We also have codes and standards. Again, this is a good protective environment, but it's still developed. Those codes and standards are developed for an industry or for a specific incident and may not apply as well and protect as well for a specific project in a specific environment. That's why if you develop custom criteria by assessing your safety and security risk, you have the optimum value. You increase your resilience by looking at your program in your environment, in your culture. One concept that I often hear is good engineering practice will protect this project or this program. It's not sufficient. One, even though engineers are highly trained and have a lot of experience, they typically design based on people doing the right thing, following the rules, following the practice. As we know, people don't always do that. So when we consider these mitigations and try to identify how the risks will be assessed, we need to think about how people will actually act in these situations. If they don't follow the rules, what would happen? So thinking through all of these elements help us identify an optimum level of safety and security and manage risk. When you plan for a resilient system, one of the things I consider is Stern's rubber band hypothesis. Stern says you have DNA or genetics, and they just determine the size of your rubber band. So that's your potential. And then you have your environment, and your environment stretches that rubber band. So even someone with a low potential can be stretched beyond someone that has a high potential because of environment. So how does this apply to projects or environment? Well, when you apply that at the beginning and when you consider what the safety and security risks actually are, you can build into the DNA or into the criteria that you're building that project or program or business, the potential to adapt. That becomes embedded into the program. And then you can add operational mitigations, which further stretch that potential. So we have built in DNA and we've stretched that DNA to allow for that resilience. These concepts can be applied to any program or activity. One thing that needs to be considered is that balancing risk can be tricky. Not all safety mitigations support security, and all security mitigations support safety. So you have to think through where the risk actually lies and which mitigations need to take priority. Applying and bringing the right people and including them as part of the planning, the design will get you the optimum level of risk in all areas. So how does this apply in real life? So I would like to take you through a few case studies and just talk about how applying safety and security risk across these projects provides for a more optimum level of resilience. In the first project, we were looking at a rail system that was being built across California in the US. In California, there are a number of oil fields and wind farms. And when they were looking at this alignment, they had our practice look at the different possible potential alignments for hazards and vulnerabilities. And once we evaluated the different potential alignments, we came across several that had a better or an optimum level of resilience compared to others because of their proximity to adjacent hazards. So by looking even at the early planning stages, we were able to say, picking these choices are better than these other choices because of these adjacent hazards. And that saved the project a lot of money from not having to mitigate those adjacent hazards that could have been a potential challenge for the project as it proceeded across the state. Our planning in that case and our involvement in that project didn't stop there. We continued involvement all the way through the planning process and through continuing now in the design and construction. But by avoiding those hazards at the very beginning, and this is often the biggest challenge for projects and programs, is getting safety and security and risk evaluation involved in even the very earliest stages. That is your offense. Planning is your offensive move. Often we ignore that and we involve safety and security further down the line, and then you have more of a defensive move. You have to defend against hazards that you could have avoided. Another project, another program that we are often involved in are transit-oriented developments, where they're integrating transit into another environment, commercial buildings. It brings its own challenge because different projects have different goals for risk. So when you have a commercial project that involves stores and entities that want foot traffic and want people meandering and wandering to develop business, that's very different than in a transit environment where we don't want people just meandering and wandering through that transit space. We want people who have paid their fare and are moving purposefully from place to place. So bringing those two types of environments together and assessing the hazards, how to separate the different types of activities that are wanted, evaluating how people would move through that space and what kind of vulnerabilities that brings to the rail or transit property versus the activities that you want on the business side, provides for an optimum level on both sides for the end product. This can be where you've added hotels or apartments or other commercial activities to a rail property, but it also can be any kind of mixed development. And so looking at it from all sides is important because it provides that ability to look at those hazards and vulnerabilities that are being experienced. So by doing that, we come up with the optimum level of risk, putting resources where they need to be, putting controls where they need to be. The last example that I'd like to talk about is public service during a natural disaster. There have been several times where we've been asked to assess and help where there's been either the potential for a natural disaster or one that's just happened and now they're revisiting, which of course is not optimum. And we know that climate change is bringing a lot of challenges to different areas. Here in the US where we live, we're experiencing a lot of fire danger and elevated temperatures, something we've not had, a lack of rain and drought, which again is different than we've experienced in our past history. Many times public services like transit have to evaluate how natural disasters will impact them. And by planning ahead of time, developing emergency management plans, developing programs and training people as to how to react provides for a much more robust delivery of services when that event happens. During Katrina, the buses needed to decide, that were the public service buses, needed to decide when they had to finally park those buses and get their people and staff out of the way of harm. And unfortunately, they hadn't done an immense amount of planning, and it was quite a struggle. People out in the field had to make their own decisions when it was safe for them to continue or when they needed to park and move to a place of safety. So working with transit agencies, working with projects, working with other businesses, we can assess those activities and at least build a plan for how they would respond during those times and when they should perform different levels of service and when they should stop service altogether. All of those are ways that businesses can perform and manage resilience. So with that, I'd like to leave you with some takeaways. One, evaluate programs, projects for safety and security. Look at your likelihood, your severity, and your risk. By increasing your assessment of safety and security, you increase your resilience. And planning and preparing and assessing is a lot less expensive than reacting and retrofitting. Decisions made on projects today when they're in the planning stage will have benefits for years to come. With that, I'd like to open this for questions. And please, if you have questions, you can type them in that control panel. And thank you for your attention today.
Thank you, Lurae, for a fantastic presentation. So yes, you can log in your questions in the question box on the GoToWebinar platform, and also the presentation is available in the handout box for you to download if you wish. We start with the first question. Does the safety risk assessment process differ from a security risk assessment process?
Yes, they do differ because in safety, we're typically not talking about anything intentional. Those could be natural disasters, they can be accidents. And so we look at the probability or the likelihood of that accident, and often we'll have some very good data to support that probability. And then we have the evaluation of how severe that accident would be. On the security side, we have some additional inputs that we have to consider. People don't always act in a way that we want. And in security, these are intentional activities. So we have to try to evaluate intent. And intent is usually made up of the capacity to do something wrong and the will to do something wrong. That adds to our list, and then we look at how vulnerable we are to those types of events. So that's a different look at developing that likelihood scenario, is that we have to try to look at human behavior, and by looking at what's happened in the past, what's happened in other places, we can help develop that understanding of how that intent is likely to play out in our project, in our program. So that's a bit different than the safety look at probability and severity.
Thank you. What would be your advice if project teams do not believe in mitigations are important?
Well, my advice is that you show them the outcome of not considering mitigations. Typically, there's a cost outcome. There's typically, there can be a people outcome as far as injuries. For most businesses, for most projects, that data is handily available. I was just evaluating or helping an agency look at some of their programs, and they just built a brand new facility, a very beautiful multi-use facility that acted as both an administrative space and an operations facility. And they were in the midst of having to retrofit a brand new facility because it had not been properly evaluated for safety and security. They had places where people were at risk of being hit by traffic. They had problems within the facility and how it operated. So by bringing those costs and those resource impacts to the program and explaining what kind of outcomes can be avoided, usually you can find a seat at the table for safety and security professionals.
Thank you. There is a comment and a question here about the pandemic. We are now facing impact from pandemic, a new risk from which transportation hubs were not designed for the pandemic. So the question here, how can a system be designed for the unknown or unknowns?
That's hard. That's the black swan event that we were talking about. Again, it is very difficult to protect against something that you can't imagine. Pandemic is one. 9/11 for the US was another, where we had a terrorist attack. That's very, very difficult. What we do is we try to extrapolate on our experience. We've had other types of pandemics. The problem with pandemics is they act different. And so bringing the proper public health people involved, staying with the research, I know I was involved in several COVID response activities for different agencies here in the US. And as the research evolved, we at first were heavily involved with looking at touch surfaces and how to minimize touch and disinfect. That emphasis quickly moved to this airborne and HVAC and air movement and proximity, which was all about research. And so, again, follow the data. I would say, how do you design for that? You look ahead, you understand what the science is telling us. It's hard to protect against those black swan events, but by protecting against at least historically what we know and what we know to be a pathway forward, we can be better served moving forward. We can also practice that response piece. That is a piece that typically will save a lot of lives, even if we don't have all the preparation and planning for the actual event.
Thank you. Next question is there a difference between risk assessment processes for capital projects or system modifications versus assessment of hazards encountered during day-to-day operations?
Yes, there's some difference, but the same process can be used. Typically, it's who you involve. That's one difference. You want to bring the planners and designers, but you always need those operations people, the people that are involved in operating that business, because that's where the hazards will show themselves. Obviously, there's a monetary difference when you're looking at evaluating a design. You have the option to change that design based on what you find. Once you're in an environmental, or once you're in an operating mode, you have to lean more heavily on operational mitigations. Typically not quite as effective, but more cost effective perhaps than redesigning something. But the process is the same. You just have to take into account what is actually there, whether that's an existing structure or whether that's just design. So I think the process can be used similar, but you have to understand the resulting operation and how it will be used in either situation and bring the right people to the table.
Thank you. There is a question here about measuring the effectiveness of controls as mitigation to risk. Is this or should this be also considered?
It should. I also always say that safety and security is never a one and done. You always need to revisit the controls to make sure they're actually performing the way that you want them to perform. It is unlikely that you'll get it right every time the first time. And beside that, environment changes, people change, the way they use space changes. So the control that was working last week may not work next year when perhaps the neighborhood has evolved or other things have changed in that environment. So it is always important to come back and revisit your controls to see if they're still effective. And as for measuring, data is always king here. You need to track the data. You need to trend and find out what accidents are actually happening, what your experience level is, because that also helps you continually assess the risk. And again, if you base your resource allocation on risk, then you can watch those controls, manage those controls, and measure how effective those controls are and decide when you need to intervene again.
Thank you. We're going a bit over, but there are many interesting questions coming through. So let's continue for a few more minutes. Why is it not sufficient to just follow codes or apply good engineering principles? Can you provide an example?
Sure. So I will tell you an example here. We were designing a potential tunnel for a rail system, and the code and the engineering design decided that because this was a high-speed rail, that in this tunnel, if an incident happened, they would just merely, one, either travel to the next station because the train would be very fast, or two, they would depend on a rescue train. to come and take the people out of the tunnel. And they did not want to design in a tenable space or a safe space in that tunnel for people to move off the train. And when we started talking about it, and one of the events or one of the incidents we were evaluating was a fire. And the concept was, well, people would be safe to stay on the train until another train arrived. And as we talked, and I said, I'm not sure the people that you deal with, the people I deal with, would not stay on a burning train waiting for someone to show up. So by thinking through how actually people actually would respond in those events, the engineering solution wasn't as palatable as what we needed to do to actually protect those people, because it was fairly certain they would move off the train. There are a lot of examples where we need to go beyond just what would be that regulation and provide a space, because people don't always act the way we think they will act.
Thank
Another
you.
question?
Yeah, there's a question here about estimation of likelihood and severity. How would you recommend that an agency estimate likelihood and severity if they don't have that type of experience in-house for a specific project?
Well, there's always consultant agencies like ours. You can reach out to like agencies that are working in that same business, whether it's transit or other businesses, and find out what their experience is. I would caution that you want to look for agencies that are similar to yours in size and delivery of service. Find out what their experiences are. There is a lot of data out there. There are industry forums that you can reach out to. But I would say you want to get some expertise in data. Again, data-driven is your best response. Severity is something that you can look at based on the way you deliver services, what those impacts are. I would look to your association. APTA, American Public Transportation Association, has a lot of data. UITP in Europe is a similar association. All of those are places where data sharing and information is usually very available if you reach out to people within your same business.
Thank you. The last question that I will take is, when building a risk matrix, do you prefer to add likelihood score to the severity score, or multiplying those two numbers?
Well, I typically, unless an agency uses something different, I usually add them together, but I don't often do quantitative. I usually do qualitative with the right safety and security professionals in the room, and we use a matrix. And so if it's a high severity and a low probability, then you get a level of risk. So it's usually an additive factor. But as long as the risk outcome provides the level of tolerance that your agency is used, then there's really not a wrong methodology. Mine just happens to be more of an additive methodology.
Fantastic, thank you. So we're at the end of our webinar session. Please feel free to follow up directly with Lurae via the contact details shown on the screen. And I would like to thank all attendees for joining today. And thank you again, Lurae, for a fantastic presentation.
Thank you. Goodbye.